was bedded in.
Welcome to it. I am your host, Jon Justice, back again for another Star Wars show where we're going to talk about, for the most part, the Book of Boba Fett, Chapter 6. I'm calling it Grogu's Choice. I know the official title was it From the Desert Comes a Stranger? Is that what it is? Am I getting that wrong? I didn't write it in front of me. I should have, but obviously referring to a particular character that showed at the end of the chapter, and we'll dive into it and give my thoughts on that a little bit later on in the episode. But as always, if you want to email TalkShowNerd@gmail.com, leave a comment up on YouTube if you happen to be watching the YouTube version of this show. It is there is a video version of the show for those that are listening to the podcast. You want to go check it out. I add in pictures and my face and trailers and videos and stuff like that if you're into that kind of thing. And as I mentioned, you can leave a comment up on YouTube and I'll share that on listener feedback, of which we do have a few to share this week. So let's go ahead and dive into this week's The Book of Boba Fett. This would be, again, Chapter 6. Let's see how far I can get along in the show without calling it an episode. No, it was Chapter 6, and it was another fantastic episode. And a lot of expectations for Chapter 6. We have one more chapter left in the Book of Boba Fett. But Chapter 6 was directed by the heir apparent to George Lucas, Dave Filoni, and it didn't disappoint by any stretch. I've heard nothing. Well, let me take that back. Not nothing but praise. I've heard mostly praise. There are plenty of bad hot takes out there, in my opinion. Art, movies, TV, whatever, it's all subjective. I've talked about that before. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. But I was reading an article yesterday from Bounding Into Comics, and the hot take was one of the hot takes that I really just don't like. And it's if they had done it this way, it would have been better. It's like, well, no, you don't have to like something. Nobody is saying you have to like a particular thing. But to take that stance of, it would have been better if it was done a different way, the way that I wanted it done. To me, that's lazy. If you didn't like it, you didn't like it. That's cool. From what I've heard from most people, they really enjoyed Chapter 6. And I only have one. It's not even a complaint. It's more of an observation. It only kind of bothered me on a rewatch, and it's something that. It's something that's more in line with the way that Dave Filoni directs, whether it's animated, and not all his animation, but some of his animated endeavors, or his live action stuff. And I'll get into that a little bit further into the show. But I just want to share some instinctive reactions. I know a lot of podcasts and YouTube shows are going to go through point by point. I'm just going to share with you sort of my instinctive reactions of what stuck out to me, what I enjoyed, a little bit of commentary, and then some speculating on what we can expect moving forward, especially with the way that the episode wrapped up with Luke providing a choice to Grogu. I personally think it's obvious which way Grogu will choose. I think it's obvious from a best storytelling, perhaps, perspective, but also obvious with what we know of the content that is further along in the timeline that's already been created. So we'll get into that. But let's just start off with the show itself and some of the things that really stuck out to me. It was awesome to see to see the return of Cobb Vanth, and to get more perspective on the Pikes and what they are doing on Tatooine. Really raised the stakes, I think, and added more depth to the Pikes and their smuggling and running of spice on the planet. Did a great job of showcasing how Cobb Vanth has been able to protect what is now Freetown, as we found out later in the episode, and the rather interesting move on Cobb Vanth's part to dump the spice. As the Pike said in that opening scene after he took out all but one of them, that amount of spice was worth more than the town, and is to be looked at like it's a drug, right? George Lucas lifted directly from Dune when creating Star Wars, and I dig that, and I like the fact that we've seen content that's done the same with George Lucas. I did something very similar when it came to writing my EMBARK stories, especially book 1 in my science fiction series. In the way that I crafted the story, I was incredibly inspired by what George Lucas had done in his storytelling. And so the fact that George lifted so much from Dune, including having a sand planet, which ended up being Tatooine, but also now we have this inclusion of spice, and something that's been in the canon for a long, long time, the spice mines of Kessel. But now we see it firsthand. And I love how they've made the spice look distinct too. And that's hard to do. I actually feel like they did a better job in the Book of Boba Fett of showing the spice than they even did in the Dune movie. Now, the Dune movie didn't really lend itself to seeing sort of a pile of spice as far as I can remember. We saw it blowing, in the sand. And I think at one point we saw Paul Atreides reach up and lift up a handful of sand, and you can see some spice in it. But when Cobb Vanth dumped the little container, or not really little, but the container of spice, and we also saw it in, I think, episode 2, if I'm not mistaken. You can definitely tell the difference between the spice and the sand. And then we move on to the Mando going to see Grogu, which we all expected from last week's episode. And I expected it. Also was prepared that we would have to wait to see that until Mandalorian season 3, but we didn't. And you get the standard shots of Mando flying his spaceship heading towards a planet, just so very Star Wars and what we all expect. And I saw somebody, I think it was at the Space Shipper on Twitter, fantastic Twitter account, by the way. He especially for people like me that love space vehicles. He just tweets all day about space vehicles from all types of different science fiction content. But he made a comment that George Lucas was always very keen on giving you good wide shots of the spaceships. And especially coming in and seeing them land, he was highlighting the Starliner from the previous episodes and even Slave One. And we got something similar with this chapter of the Book of Boba Fett a number of different times. Mando arriving on the planet where he finds R2-D2 and the androids, which we'll get to here in a moment, and of course Ahsoka and Luke. But we see the ship coming down to land. You get a nice, beautiful shot of that. And then later on in the episode, when he returns to Tatooine, we get something similar as well. Just fantastic filmmaking and cinematography. But we arrive on the planet. Hasn't been established what planet this is. Some people have been speculating that it could be Agen Kloss, which we saw obviously in the Rise of Skywalker. This is where the Rebel base was at in that film, where Luke had trained against Leia in the flashback that we saw in the Rise of Skywalker. I've seen a little pushback on this simply from the standpoint of, if it was Agen Kloss, is this the place where the permanent temple is that Luke was building? If it was, then Ben Solo would have been there, in which case he probably would have known where to find the Resistance. Also, the temple that is being built by the androids itself looks very similar to the huts that we saw on Ahch-To. Looks very similar to the flashbacks that we saw in The Last Jedi. However, as many people have pointed out, there doesn't seem to be mountains in the background in the flashback scenes from The Last Jedi. But you could also argue, and I was wondering if it perhaps was from a different perspective, and if that's the way they can get away with it, wherein we saw the Jedi Temple that was being built and then finished by the androids in the Book of Boba Fett episode. Perhaps what we saw from the film, from The Last Jedi, was from the other angle, and there may have been mountains behind. That's just a theory that I had. Either way, there was a lot more vegetation in this particular episode on this planet than there was in The Last Jedi. So if they were going for a one-to-one comparison, it doesn't look to be the same planet that we saw on The Last Jedi. But we also know that there's, a couple of decades that pass between what we saw in Chapter 6 of the Book of Boba Fett and what we see in The Last Jedi, even with the time difference of the flashback from the actual events in The Last Jedi. So it remains to be seen what planet that that actually was, or if Luke moved around 2 different temples. The androids I thought were cool, if not a little bit creepy. Very much in the vein of Star Wars. I love to see the new content where they bring in a new droid or a new element, but it still has that same Star Wars aesthetic where it looks like something and is very reminiscent of something in the real world. And seeing all of those androids building the Jedi Temple, I mean, it very much looked like a bunch of ants going and building something. I thought that was really cool. The whole exchange with R2-D2 was interesting and funny. Kind of gives you a little bit more depth into R2. You know, he's smarter, right? And I think people forget that. He's a very smart droid. And he tells, you know, the ant droid to build Din Djarin a bench because he knows he's going to be waiting a while. And then just shuts off. I thought that was actually, you know, very subtle, but very, very comedic. And then we have Ahsoka. And Ahsoka ends up being on the same planet. And my wife had asked this question. Why was she there? Okay. Of which I thought the same thing. So why is Ahsoka there? We don't know why Ahsoka's there. When we last saw her in the last episode that we saw directed by Dave Filoni, right, in The Mandalorian Season 2, she was heading off, presumably to go find Grand Admiral Thrawn and Ezra, presumably to hook up with Sabine based off of the ending of Rebels, of which we know that the ending of Rebels takes place after the events that we saw in Season 2 of her episode in The Mandalorian. My theory on this is that we're going to find out why Ahsoka was there in the Ahsoka series. And I think a lot of this plays into the book part, doing that thing with my fingers of the book of Boba Fett. And I'll get into a little bit more of that here in a moment, because I think that Lucasfilm and the writers, Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni and the like, are doing something very clever. And we're beginning to see, if not, we have now seen their intent in their storytelling of live-action Disney Plus content, Star Wars content, very much in the same way that we know how the Marvel Cinematic Universe works, okay? But getting into a few more of my instinctive reactions from Chapter 6, Luke Skywalker. They hired a guy who was a master of deep fakes online, a fan, who went and took the Season 2 finale, Luke, did a deep fake on it, and it looked better than the version that they had in the season finale, and they hired that guy, and it paid off because Luke looks absolutely fantastic. He looks better than I could have imagined, and it's only going to look better. I mean, this is 2 years advancement in technology, and really the only uncanny valley thing, which is just that ability that we have to look at a character and know that there's just something off by it, right? They call it the uncanny valley. The only uncanny valley aspect of Luke that I had was still in the talking. We know that Mark Hamill is voicing the character. They used a different actor this time than was used in the Mandalorian Season 2 finale. So it was a different actor that they used as his body and the head until they placed the CGI and the deep fake face on him. The only thing that still is a little off is the mouth and a bit of the voice. Mark Hamill is doing the voice, but his voice has changed, so they have to age his voice down, just like they have to age him down. And the mouth just still isn't quite right. But even saying that, I think for an individual who was just kind of dumped into watching this after watching Return of the Jedi and not thinking about it, wouldn't pick up on the fact that this was a deep faked CGI version of a younger Luke. Just looked absolutely fantastic. And in terms of his demeanor, I know that there was some criticism about Luke Skywalker and how he acted in the episode, but if you go back and watch Return of the Jedi, I mean, his demeanor and his sense of calm in Chapter 6 is very much in line with the way that he was in Return of the Jedi. And, of course, we get the training montage with Grogu on his back, and he's running through the forest and flipping, just like very reminiscent of poetry. It rhymes, of The Empire Strikes Back. And the entire training montage with Grogu was just spectacular. What an amazing character that they've created with Grogu, and seeing, as Luke said in the episode, not so much being trained by Luke, but more Luke helping him to remember his training. Seeing him run over the rocks and jump, much in the same way that we saw Yoda in Attack of the Clones and in Revenge of the Sith. Hearing Luke talk about Yoda makes you wonder, he's got to be aware of Yoda. I mean, Luke kind of talks to him as if he wouldn't be aware of Yoda, but then again, at the same time, Luke wasn't there, during, post Clone Wars, at Order 66. So we don't know how much Luke knows of what he endured. Seeing the flashback, some speculation in the flashback scene, which I liked because it was definitely a riff of what we saw on the sequel trilogy. That stupid Bounding Into Comics article that I mentioned earlier was complaining about the fact that, Chapter 6 is cementing the sequel trilogy. And it's like, you know what? But there are those of us, and a lot of us, that love the sequel trilogy. And seeing Luke touch his head, Grogu's head, and seeing the flashback of Grogu, which we presume is on Coruscant, being defended by a couple of Jedi before getting wiped out by the clone troopers and then rescued by somebody. Very much in line with the way that we saw those Force connections and flashbacks especially in The Rise of Skywalker, when Kylo Ren is confronting Rey. We had the moment, but we don't see it in The Force Awakens. But we have that moment when he's confronting Rey and he tells her to see her parents, and then we get the flashback of her parents being killed by Ochi of Bassoon. So that was very much in line with what we saw in the sequel trilogy, and I love those connections. And of course, the obvious sort of rhyming and poetry in how we saw the past of Din Djarin come into play in his flashbacks, and of course the flashbacks of Boba Fett as well. So just keeping with the theme and the consistency that we saw there. So before we get back to the end of the episode in Grogu, moving forward in the episode, though, finally really getting the gangster vibe. Starting off with the Pikes versus Cobb Vanth at the beginning of the episode, that nightclub bombing of the Pikes was jarring and kind of gut wrenching. Right? R.I.P. Jennifer Beals. We hardly saw thee. Bummed about that. I really liked her character. But it really did kind of give that gangster vibe and set us up nicely for this grand finale we're supposed to get next week. We've got mods. We've got Black Kirstanton. We've got the Mandalorian and Boba Fett, along with Fennec Shand, now facing off against the Pikes in this final episode. I mentioned this last week, and I'll bring it up again now, and that is, I do wonder if this episode next week is potentially what Kathleen Kennedy was referring to in this, we're bringing all these characters together. I don't necessarily think so. I think she's talking about a larger event that will end up involving Ahsoka once we get that show. However, I think there's a possibility that she potentially could have been referring to this last episode. I don't expect to see Ahsoka show up, except to say, if Grogu chooses what I think he's going to choose, I think there's a possibility. Okay? We are led to believe in Chapter 6 that Ahsoka leaves prior to Grogu's choice at the end. So if Grogu chooses the Mandalorian, and let me just jump ahead and tell you that's what I believe is going to happen, and I'll give you my reasons why in a moment, then I wonder if we couldn't see a Luke bring Grogu to Tatooine in the middle of when this Pike War against Boba Fett's group is taking place. Or perhaps could it be Ahsoka that brings him there? So we'll get back into more of that in a moment. And then at the end, before we get Grogu's choice, of course, we have what I believe was the reference to the title of the episode of From the Desert Comes a Stranger. And again, I hope I'm getting that right. We get Cad Bane. And fan favorite, loved Cad Bane from the Clone Wars. and was fantastic seeing him in live action. I know somebody has already done a better doing that thing with my fingers version, they say, of Cad Bane than what we saw. But the Cad Bane that we saw is fantastic. He looks a little bit paler. His blue is a little more pale than what we expected, and his face is a little different, but that is to be expected. But he was terrifying, man. That was really, in terms of your Kurosawa, your Western standoff, I couldn't even point to any Western where we saw a standoff that was that tense, and where the bad guy was as terrifying as Cad Bane was. The one thing that popped into my head was, and I think it's only in the special extended edition of Lord of the Rings Return of the King, is when the visage of Sauron comes out. And I might be getting that wrong. I love my Lord of the Rings, but I get the characters all mixed up. But there's a creature, an evil humanoid type creature that shows up towards the end of that film in the special edition. It's got these nasty teeth and gets killed by Aragorn, I believe. But he had just this terrifying teeth in the way that he talked. And when I was watching Cad Bane and the way that he spoke, I was reminded, because that scene from Lord of the Rings was terrifying. And it makes you wonder too. So is Cad Bane going to bring a crew with him? Because he's usually running with a crew. He obviously went out of his way to walk to Freetown, so we hadn't seen his ship. But I just wonder how he is going to play into the next episode. Will we see him play into the next episode? But the introduction of Cad Bane and the potential to get a lot more with that character has me really excited. I also don't believe that Cobb Vanth is dead. They didn't give us a specific shot of him being dead. I think his deputy is definitely dead, and I think that also lends evidence to the fact that Cobb Vanth isn't dead, because that deputy was clearly there to get killed on screen to show how bad Cad Bane was. But Cobb Vanth, I think, is too important of a character to have killed off at the hands of Cad Bane. And again, you had a lot of people rushing to his aid at the end of that scene, which just makes me believe that no, he's indeed not. He's not dead. So he'll show back up. And if Fennec Shand can get replacement parts from the mods, then so can Cobb Vanth. And again, all of this makes sense as the Book of Boba Fett. We speculated before the season even started that this series could potentially bring in a lot of different characters and show different events from different perspectives. We spent the majority of the first part, and we spent all of the first 4 episodes on Boba Fett, and then the next 2 we get a little appearance of Boba Fett in Chapter 6, none of Boba Fett in 5, but it all leads to this grand finale that we're supposed to get next week. And again, we speculated the series would be covering different tales and their connection to Boba, and I think that's where the book part of this comes in. And I also think this is the storytelling that we can expect moving forward from Lucasfilm and their live-action shows, Star Wars shows on Disney+, is this interconnectivity. Probably we'll see it less in shows like Andor. They could possibly have connections, though, to the Bad Batch animated series, right? Some people speculating that it could have been Obi-Wan Kenobi as the person who rescued Grogu from Coruscant. Nerdist did a really interesting video and put up an article on Nerdist.com. Tried to put together the timeline of the events of Order 66 and where Grogu would have been in relation to where Obi-Wan Kenobi would have been, and it actually made quite a bit of sense that there's a possibility that either Yoda or Obi-Wan Kenobi could have been the ones that rescued Grogu from Coruscant during Order 66, and the speculation that we could see the first of our Obi-Wan Kenobi live-action show, which we're expecting in May, to potentially be in the Book of Boba Fett, which would be interesting if we ended up seeing a flashback or a trailer at the end of Chapter 7 of the Book of Boba Fett. We've got to be getting a trailer soon, though, and I think that once we get past the Book of Boba Fett, it'll be game on for the promotion of the next big thing. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it might be the Obi-Wan Kenobi series. I know a lot of people were speculating that maybe we'll get Bad Batch in between. I don't have an article up in front of me. Maybe I'll cover that on next week's show. All right, so a few more things on this chapter, and then we'll move over to some other issues, including the Book of Boba Fett having a weird influence on vintage toys, and I should have bought my Naboo Starfighters while I had the chance. Grogu needs to choose. At the end of the episode, Luke ends up doing a Morpheus, right? Pick one. If you want the chainmail made from the best car created by your buddy Mando, then you can have it, but you're not going to be a Jedi, and you're going to go off to be with the Mandalorian. Or I can give you Yoda's lightsaber, and I can continue to train you as a Jedi, but you may never see Mando again, because you live a lot longer than other individuals, and training takes a long time. I really don't have any doubt that Grogu is going to end up going with the Mandalorian. And I think he goes with the Mandalorian. Not only does he get the chainmail, but he also gets the lightsaber. Couple of different reasons for this. One, from what they've created in terms of content standpoint, it makes sense. If he's training with Luke, was he there when the altercation took place with Ben Solo, when he ended up becoming Kylo Ren, and what happened to him? Where was he during the events of the sequel trilogy? Not to mention the fact that we have a movie called The Last Jedi, and if Luke spends the majority of his time between the Book of Boba Fett and The Force Awakens, he's going to be kind of a Jedi, and unless they plan on killing off Grogu in between now and then, which I don't think they are, I think it's pretty clear that he goes with Mando. Now, on a more practical standpoint, it makes more sense that way. Grogu has shown showed it in Chapter 6, his lack of concentration, right? How distracted he is, showed how much he wanted to see the Mandalorian. And from a practical perspective, I don't think that we went that we did all that we did to give the Mandalorian his new hot rod N1 Naboo Starfighter, complete with the droid port being taken out, replaced with a space and an airtight dome that's perfect size for Grogu, and the fact that the Mando's ship now, which again, I don't think we went through all that, for him to get another one or a bigger one, it's not really conducive for bounty hunting. All signs are lining up to Grogu is going to end up choosing to go with the Mandalorian. And I think that sets up for some of the speculation out there and what I talked about last week, and that is the potential that Grogu could be the one to carry the mantle when we eventually end up back on Mandalore and we get a final resolution to the Darksaber, and the fact that Grogu will have training in the Jedi ways, but also is a foundling according to the Mandalorian, and he'll be a little bit of both, just like the first wielder of the Darksaber. And going back to what Disney's intention is with their live-action Star Wars content, this is why Ahsoka was in this episode. We'll probably get the other perspective of her going there in Chapter 6 in the Ahsoka show. Clearly, Book of Boba is setting up for the Mandalorian Season 3. We all know that. That happened in Chapter 5, and I think we're going to see even more of it coming up in Chapter 7. The only criticism that I have of Chapter 6, and again, it's minor. It didn't really bother me, and while I love Filoni's stories and his storytelling, he does slow things down a bit. He did that in Rebels. There's some episodes of the Clone Wars. The Ahsoka episode in The Mandalorian Season 2, I love it. Don't misunderstand, but it was a little slower. I think Filoni lends his directing style and his storytelling a little bit closer to the source material of those Akira Kurosawa stories and what George Lucas was inspired by, and Westerns as well. Again, it didn't really bother me, but it also does serve to highlight the difference between TV and theatrical. TV can do that, and there's always another episode to bring in a lot more action and speed things up. And slowing a 50-minute episode of a television series down, there's nothing wrong with that, doing it in TV. But I'm also a bigger fan of the theatrical experience, and this is why I will always advocate for theatrical Star Wars. I've heard arguments out there of, this is where Star Wars belongs as live-action television content, and I completely disagree. I think there's a place for it, and I'm loving it, and I think it's great. That being said, there is an absolutely different experience with theatrical Star Wars. I love the live-action TV content, but there's a scale and a scope that is simply less epic on TV, and I haven't seen that replicated yet. And I honestly don't think that we will. I think the TV is going to be very much in line with what we've seen in live-action TV. The closest I think we'll get, and it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, could potentially be what we end up seeing in the Obi-Wan Kenobi show. I do think that the possibility there, especially with the rematch that we are all expecting between Anakin, Darth Vader, and Obi-Wan Kenobi, Andor too. I think let me throw Andor in there as well. So I guess I take it back a bit. I think that there could be a possibility that we do get a more theatrical vibe from Andor and Obi-Wan Kenobi, especially from what we know of Andor and the fact that they shot a lot of stuff on location and way less on the volume LED screen stage. So that remains to be seen. As always, what do you think? I do have some listener feedback to dive into a little bit later on as we get through one more story here. But I want to know what you think of the episode. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com or leave a comment up on YouTube. All right, let's move on to another quick article here from Gizmodo before we hear from you, the viewer and listener to the show.
Something inside me has always been there. But now it's awake. And I need help.
I called it on last week's episode. I said this was going to happen, and I should have taken advantage of it, and I didn't. From Gizmodo. Star Wars loves two things above all, its own history and its own metatextual history with merchandise. Sometimes those come hand in hand, and what is old isn't exactly new again, but it does suddenly have more people wanting it for more money. Chapter 5 of the Book of Boba Fett. Din teamed up with a recurring Mandalorian guest star, Pelimoto, Amy Sedaris, to replace his destroyed Razor Crest with a new vessel. His new ship is much smaller and quicker, as well as very familiar to Star Wars fans, the sleek lines of the N1 Naboo Starfighter, the chosen combat vessel of the Phantom Menace. One extensive rebuild montage later, Din finds himself rather enjoying a stripped-down, paint-scraped version of the iconic ship, tweaked enough ways to look a little more than unique, but still immediately identifiable as Doug Chang's legendary Starfighter design, to the delight of prequel-era fans across the world. I just watched The Phantom Menace this past week. The fighter's reappearance in the episode, complete with a fantastic little test flight sequence that in and of itself evoked the Phantom Menace pod race set piece, has had one rather peculiar impact beyond the prequel's nostalgia, though. If you've got, which I do, sitting right over there, a 23-year-old lights and sound version of the ship that launched as part of the Phantom Menace's toy line in 1999, you might be sitting on quite a pretty penny. I bought that when it first came out on the day the toys went on sale, and I had it hanging in my apartment later that afternoon. It's sitting right over there behind me with my other Star Wars toys. In the past couple of days, since the Book of Boba Fett's latest episode aired, eBay auctions for Hasbro's classic Naboo Starfighter toy, or one similar one released by the company in 2011, and I'm not familiar with the 2011 one, I need to look that up, have exploded in value, whether they were listed in the wake of people's airing or one of a handful floating around on the resale site in the months before. On average, the new listings, some of which call out the Mandalorian's new connection to the ships explicitly, not just in the listing of the names, but in some cases bundling in one of Hasbro's own recent 3 3/4 scale Din Djarin figures in to boot, are selling for hundreds of dollars, well beyond the $30 the ship retailed for when it was brand new. Old listings for the ship, even before the episode aired, have found their early low offers shoot up in bidding frenzies, and some are even customizing the classic toy to appear more closely to the stripped-down iteration that appears in the Book of Boba Fett, and expecting quite a bounty in turn. Given Disney and Lucasfilm's tendency to lean towards the absurd when it comes to keeping secrets about Star Wars from fans, it's about Star Wars from fans. It's likely we won't see Hasbro capitalize on the sudden resurgence of interest in the Naboo fighter. I want one bad. That's the new one because I have the old one. It's getting to make a new one explicitly styled after Din's new ride with products anytime soon. That's the nature of merchandising. Sometimes the toy maker's only just gotten around to releasing its Black Series line of Fennec and Boba based on the Mandalorian Season 2 appearances with a Book of Boba Fett specific version of the title character, not even expected until later this year. Same thing happened with Grogu. Can't get away from Grogu stuff now, though, right? So, we're not going to get any products of the N1 Naboo Starfighter anytime soon, and that, honestly, makes me sad. Because I want one really, really bad. So listen, if you got one to sell at a cheap, reasonable price, hit me up, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. I'll take it off your hands. All right, let's go ahead and dive into this week's listener feedback.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
All right, as we get into this week's listener feedback, I want to say a quick shout-out to Edwin Lowe from the Lowdown Show, L-O Lowdown Show. You can check that out on YouTube. This was a great episode, a lot to enjoy. From the old trilogy to the prequels to the Clone Wars animation show to the Mandalorian solo film and more. The introduction of Cad Bane was awesome. I am one happy Star Wars fan today, writes Edwin. I am too, Edwin. I loved it, and thank you so much. A friend of the show for the email. All right, friend of the show also. SheVP, talking about Chapter 5, said, I was grinning from ear to ear this entire episode. Favreau just seems to be in his element when he's writing Din. It's just beautiful. And it would be amazing if we have more interaction between Din and Luke. Unfortunately, we didn't get that. I would love to see Luke give Din some pointers on how to properly wield a lightsaber. And I think there's obviously a very specific reason for that, because this is something that Din Djarin, the Mandalorian, is going to have to go through on his own in finding out how to wield the lightsaber after that training session with the armorer, right? It's going to take him some time to figure out how he can connect with it. And I don't think that's something that Luke would be able to help him with right away. And how cool would it be if Luke recognizes the N1 and tells Din that those ships were made for his mother's royal guards? That would have been cool, but alas, we didn't get it. I just can't wait. Great show as usual, John. Thank you so much, SheVP, friend of the show. I really appreciate it as always. All right. Howard Jr. writes, Hey, John, I'm still listening to my Nerd World, even though I haven't written in a while. That's okay. I absolutely enjoyed The Mandalorian Season 3 opener, Book of Boba Fett Chapter 5. This chapter had me more excited watching it than the rest of Book of Boba Fett. I even put it on for my wife, who hasn't seen any of it yet, emphasizing that it won't spoil anything for her. She's been pretty busy with work and school. Now I know the Book of Boba Fett has had a slow run, but I can definitely feel this is leading up to a big finale, and I'm looking forward to it. Very respectfully, Howard Jr. Thank you, Howard. Also a friend of the show. I very much appreciate it. And listen, next week's going to be interesting, because next week is another episode that's directed, by Robert Rodriguez. Name escaped me for a moment. And he hasn't done the best job with the two episodes that he's done. They're probably my least favorite. The opening episode and then the episode with the slow mod gang chase of the mayor's assistant. So we'll see. Because I love the episode that he did with the introduction of a fully armored Boba Fett in Mandalorian Season 2. So we'll see what he has to do. All right, a name that we haven't heard from in a while. Mike Rotunda writes in. Got a couple of different comments here. Wow, finally, writes Mike. We are getting what I have wanted since I walked out of the movie theater in '83 after seeing Return of the Jedi. The story continues from that point in Star Wars. Yes, now this is what we want, he says. Well, let's stop for a moment. The Mandalorian took place right after Return of the Jedi, too. So, just saying. But I understand what he's saying right after Return of the Jedi. Okay, in the flashbacks. Now, this is what we want, he says. Okay, finally, Disney has found their groove with Star Wars. Multiple exclamation points. We got Ahsoka, Bane, Master Luke, and he looks great. Now we can see Master Luke how we wanted to. Thank you, Dave Filoni. They heard us. They got rid of that crap Rey and Finn. Nobody wants that. Not true. and got to give Disney credit. Looks like they heard us after all. I love it. They're making the Star Wars world bigger. They should have been doing this from the beginning. This is unbelievable. We are getting an overall connected storyline, just like Marvel. I'm excited. The options are limitless. Thank you for the messages from YouTube there, Mike. And listen, and I know you don't like the stuff that Disney has done when it comes to the sequels, but a lot of us do. And nobody wants that. That's not true. The Rey and Finn got rid of that crap. No, they haven't. They're going to return to those characters, right? And there's connections in this to the sequels. So I get it. You know, I'm so glad that you're excited and you're getting Star Wars that you enjoy. You didn't enjoy the other stuff. But don't enjoy and love the new stuff at the expense of tearing it down for the individuals that love the sequel stuff. Because it doesn't help anybody in the fandom, okay? People do want Rey and Finn. They do want Rey and Kylo. They do like the sequels, right? And I don't think that this is Disney listening to the fans. I think it's Disney creating content that they planned on creating. We'll get back to sequel trilogy content at some point in time. The timeline will extend beyond the Rise of Skywalker, and there will be connections to what happened in those movies. We'll get live action shows that'll have direct connections, probably even with the characters of the sequel trilogy. So again, Mike, I'm really glad that you're excited and that you got Star Wars that you can enjoy again. I just hope that you'll enjoy it and not tear down the other content that you don't enjoy that millions of Star Wars fans do absolutely enjoy. All right, and that wraps up the show this week. As always, thank you so much for listening to my Nerd World of Star Wars podcast and watching up on YouTube. If you want to support the channel, like and subscribe. If you want to support the channel and the podcast, I don't do Patreon, but I do ask if you're a reader or if you know anybody, friend or family that likes to read science fiction, that you'll take a moment and check out my EMBARK science fiction space opera series available on Amazon.com, or you can go to mynerdworld.net. 6 books in all. The audiobook for book 6 has now been submitted for those that have been waiting for the audio version of Fear the Dangerous Night. As soon as it's approved by Audible, it'll be available. But the rest of the books, including book 6, are available in ebook, a paperback, and a hardback, along with audiobooks for the first 5. I'm wrapping up writing book 7 this weekend and hope to have it finished in the next couple of weeks and out at least within the next month. So this will wrap up the series so far. Get caught up by, again, going to Amazon.com or to mynerdworld.net. For book 1, for those that aren't familiar with my science fiction space opera story, based on Earth at a time in the future, here is the storyline. The stars are within reach. Interstellar travel is now possible with global corporations D Corp and Intercon providing air and space flight to all humanity. But when an industrial accident inside D Corp sets off a catastrophic chain of events threatening all of Earth, the global evacuation begins. Amid the growing chaos, Taft Guardia and Keith Amaro and a ragtag squadron of pilots discover a mysterious device. As the ruthless Sen Argam of D Corp, with an armada of starships at his disposal, attempts to exploit the disaster, Taft and Keitha realize that they alone hold the key to saving humanity from the tyranny of D Corp's evil leader. If you're watching on YouTube, on the banner on my YouTube page, there's a link right to the Amazon page. Go and check it out. Ebooks are available for $2.99, and then the paperbacks and hardbacks are priced appropriately, as are the audiobooks. So I hope you'll support the show and pick up your preferred copy for you or a friend. Great for all ages, written for adults, but children as young as 11 have enjoyed them, much in the same vein as Star Wars in terms of content and action and violence and stuff like that. So go check out my EMBARK series. Thank you so much for watching and listening to the show again this week, and we'll be back again next week as we'll talk about the finale to the book of Boba Fett, Chapter 7. And I think I got through the entire show without saying episode, apart from my episode. Unless I just did a moment ago, in which case I failed. Either way, thank you so much for checking the show out. I really do appreciate it. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My Nerd World.